Hi everyone and welcome to this Astranti video where we are today going to be looking at CIMA's interim feedback report for the May and August MCS exam sittings. Now obviously this is the first window where CIMA are doing their 6-month exam window, so we are of course dealing with our pre-seen company Alpaca in both May and August. And to sort of tie us over here, CIMA have released this interim report to provide feedback on candidate performance in the May sitting to help those sitting the same exams in August. So let's crack on with the video and scroll down to the initial general comments that CIMA has released in this report. Now many of these essentially just centre around providing us with a brief reminder about Alpaca Hotel Group, which is of course our pre-seen company. But perhaps one of the most useful points we can take out from these first two paragraphs is that many answers demonstrated a good understanding of the background information provided in the pre-seen. Now this may sound like quite a simple point, but this just reinforces the importance of really getting to grips and really understanding the detail provided to you by CIMA in this pre-seen document. You're meant to take on the role of an employee within this organisation in the exam and answer questions as if you were this employee from Alpaca's perspective. And you can't do that if you don't understand the company that you're working for. Okay, so a strong knowledge of the pre-seen is obviously vital in this regards. Moving on down the document, we're then provided with specific feedback from the CIMA marking team in relation to each of the 5 core activities at MCS. Okay, so starting with evaluate opportunities to add value, core activity A. Now this core activity centres around candidates making and justifying recommendations in relation to scenarios provided in the unseen. And we're told by CIMA that candidates who performed well in relation to these areas were able to develop an understanding of the issues arising from the unseen scenario and then applying the relevant models or techniques to those specific issues, okay? So obviously a key part of success at case study exam is firstly being able to demonstrate your knowledge of theory, of models that you've learned over the course of the 3 OT exams preceding it. However, crucially, you need to be able to apply these 2 scenarios that you come up against in the unseen in the same way you would do if you were working as a real employee within a real world scenario, okay? So people who have answered this core activity really well have been able to do this process very effectively. Now this is opposed to weaker answers which seem to generally have listed and described different techniques for decision making in the context set by the question, but maybe haven't necessarily gone that step further in terms of analysing, applying it and then making recommendations or justifications based on that knowledge, okay? So here we quite clearly see the distinction between knowing and understanding your theory material from your OT exams really well, and then being able to take this a step further and actually apply it to the case company and the unseen scenarios in the exam. Core activity B then centres around implementing senior management decisions. And again here we see this distinction between understanding and knowing the theory and actually being able to take this a step further and apply it and use it to make recommendations in the exam. Okay, so we see here the good answers in relation to core activity B. Explain how businesses challenged raised in a question should be overcome, possibly justifying the recommendation being offered. And doing this using the features of a particular model or particular piece of theory, for example, in relation to the scenario in question. In contrast to this, we have weaker candidates who offer sort of detailed summaries of course theory, of course materials. They maybe list some alternative choices, some alternative options that are available, but make little or no attempt to evaluate the suitability of these options. Remember, at MCS, we are taking on a higher role within this organisation than we would do at OCS, and we're therefore taking on more responsibility as a result, okay? So as well as being able to apply theory to a scenario, we have to use this to make recommendations as we would do as a real life professional within a business organisation, okay? So quite clearly here we see a distinction between good and bad answers, where it is the good answers that take the theory knowledge, apply it effectively to the question, and then take this a step further by using this application to make effective judgments and recommendations based on this theory, knowledge and application, okay? And this is in contrast to weaker candidates who maybe do demonstrate theory knowledge, but then don't go this step further in terms of applying it and using it to make recommendations about Alpaca and its business. Core activity 3 then relates to managing performance and costs to aid value creation. Now here the distinction between a good and bad answer seems to centre around, again, your wider understanding of how the course of action that you suggested in your exam will actually impact the behaviour of colleagues and wider stakeholders. Okay, so here it's really important that you understand the wider business context surrounding your recommendation and the impact that this will have on various parties that it will affect. Okay, so we see how good answers demonstrate some sensitivity in terms of how recommendations could affect the behaviour of colleagues and other stakeholders. And we see how recommendations were also aligned to various interests involved in a scenario, whereas low marks suggest answers paid insufficient attention to motivational issues arising from a scenario. So, for example, things like a recommendation that might have led to dysfunctional behaviour. Okay, so quite clearly here we have this wider idea of applying your theory knowledge more practically to a given scenario. It's all well and good being a star student and being able to recite all of the MCS theory off the top of your head. If you lack that sort of business knowledge, that business sense, to actually apply it to real world scenarios, as that essentially is the reason why you are undergoing these exams, to prepare you for the application of your theory knowledge to real world scenarios when you become a fully qualified accountant. Core activity 4 then relates to measuring performance. And CIMA's main comment about this particular area were that stronger candidates were generally aware of the performance measures that were available to them and focused their responses on the needs of the entity and the circumstances that determined the most appropriate measure. This is in contrast to weaker candidates who tended to offer generic descriptions of performance measures, with little or no attempt to reflect the scenarios and issues raised in their descriptions. Okay, so again here quite clearly repeating this point of, yes, you need theory knowledge to do well in these exams, but crucially, you need to be able to apply this to real life scenarios. You're not looking to teach the examiner the specific area of theory that your question is on. You are looking to use this theory to address a specific issue that has come up in the unseen information in your exam. Okay, there's quite a substantial difference there. So when it actually gets to the exam itself, you need to make sure that you apply your theory knowledge in a focused manner to what you're being asked in the question, and you don't just want to recite your theory in a sort of textbook generic type approaches. This is quite clearly how CIMA says you're going to score poorly in the exam. Finally, our last core activity relates to the management of internal and external stakeholders, okay? So this requires an understanding of the interests of these parties, and once this has been established, then the likely behaviour of these parties can be better understood and influenced. So with this idea in mind, stronger candidates were generally aware of the interests of stakeholders in a particular scenario and could offer recommendations that would work in relation to these interests in a manner aligned with the company and its managers. Whereas weaker candidates, again, tended to focus on offering generic summaries that could be used to address stakeholders. Okay, and again, we get this idea from CIMA that these summaries implied a strong recall of study materials, but that this was of little help in actually advising managers in a practical manner. Okay. So like with the other 4 core activities, it is this idea of using your knowledge base that you have to actually address specific concerns, specific scenarios that you are faced with in the exam, as if you were an employee within the finance department of this business. Remember, there is a massive difference between your OT exams and these case study exams, and I think this distinction between just sort of theory learning and recitation of this and actually application of theory learning is the key distinction that's coming out of this report, as with all case study exams. Finally, we come to a range of hints and tips that will be of use to you if you plan to sit the MCS exam in August 2020. Now, the first of these tips relates to an understanding of the study materials. As we've seen, this is a base that you need to build upon in the exam. But obviously, if you don't have this base, then you can't build upon it. So it's really important that you are confident in your ability to apply syllabus content from all 5 core activities. From what we've seen about the 2019 syllabus case study exam so far, CIMA is testing these core activities quite tightly. So these should provide a good guide in terms of the theory that should and should not come up in these exams. The second point is to review the pre-scene carefully. And this is all about understanding the nature of the business and getting to grips with Alpaca in a bit more detail. And crucially, this is because you need to take into account this sort of wider understanding of the business when you are applying your understanding of the syllabus materials to the requirements in the case. Now, this is essentially just telling us what we've talked about in their video so far. Essentially that, yes, you might have your theory knowledge, but you're not going to succeed in these exams if you can't apply it in a real-life manner, an effective real-life manner to Alpaca as a business. Okay, and point 3 about practice before the exam relates to case study questions and practicing these. CIMA, like ourselves here at Astranti, is very much recommending that you practice these questions, as this is the only way for you to determine how effectively you are answering these questions and whether you are really nailing this style in terms of answering them from a real world perspective. Okay, and then moving on to tips that you can fulfill during the actual exam itself. The first of these is focus on the question requirement. Now, it's really important that you answer the specific question that you are being asked. This sounds like a really stupid thing to say, but the number of times that you see this type comment in reports of this nature, where students have maybe answered a question they would have liked to have seen in the exam rather than the actual exam, is quite amazing, okay? So what we're talking about here is ensuring that you answer the relevant aspects of the specific requirement in the question, taking account your case study revision on the specific scenario into account, okay? What we don't want to see is you answering a question you would like to see, or you just simply writing out content from your study materials, okay? It's also important that we see a credible attempt at all requirements. So each task in this exam will have 2 or more elements to it. And we see here quite clearly that weaker candidates have often only offered brief responses to 1 or more element. And this obviously limits your overall mark. If you have a 12 and a 13 mark subtask as part of a question in your exam, and you only properly address one of these, then this could be almost an 1/8 of the mark for your overall exam that you're not even attempting, and there's no chance that you're going to score. The third of these little tips within this section relates to supporting your arguments with a mix of information from the pre-scene itself, as we've talked about quite a lot in the video so far, but also relevant real-world information that can be used to support an argument, okay? So CIMA does like to see that you have looked and done a little bit of independent study in the industry around the pre-scene company, but crucially these must be relevant real-world examples. So quite clearly we can see that examples of this nature will be rewarded if it improves your answer. However, the examiner will not give credit for irrelevant examples if it doesn't really impact, if it doesn't really improve the answer that you have written, okay? So making sure that you have this wider knowledge to support your answers is obviously important. And finally, we have a last point about presentation here. Now, the main thing that CIMA reinforce here is the importance of clear and relevant answers that are split into paragraphs. So a nice sort of structure going on with maybe headings and subheadings is a useful way to split this up and ensure this clarity in your structure. However, what they are saying here is that they don't want you to see you wasting time with excessive an elaborate presentation, okay? So the use of bold type or underlining is just not necessary. And also things like greetings and social responses. In the actual exam itself, when it gets down to it, you just want to get as much on paper as you can. And if you're wasting time with these types of social responses, then it's time that you aren't going to be able to spend actually answering the question, okay? And with that last point, we've reached the end of the video today. I hope you found this useful. If there is still gaps in your MCS knowledge, if there are still areas of revision that you would like to undertake, why not head over to the Astranti website, where we have a range of great MCS content that is still available for the August sitting. Aside from that, all that's left for me to say is to wish you the very best of luck in this exam from everyone here at Astranti. We're all going to have our fingers crossed for you and hope very much that you get the result that you desire from this. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you tuned into another Astranti video again very soon.